everyone. We're Steph and Rachel, the creators of Wealth, Wisdom, and Wellbeing podcast. The spirit of this podcast is to share the conversations and curiosities that we have with a greater community in the hope that we can develop wealth, wisdom, and well-being for ourselves and those around us. Simply put, we're in the pursuit of financial freedom and opportunity, meaningful relationships and experiences, and an increased quality of life to be able to enjoy all of it. We just want to live our best lives and help you to do the same. Come with us on this journey. Let's have some laughs, learn from our communities, and get that bread. Hey, Steph.
Hi, Rach.
How's it going?
How you doing today? Good. How are you?
Good. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. I love record day. I get so pumped about all the discussions we've had and bringing them to the audience, to our listeners. This is great.
Me too. And Steph, if you'll agree, I feel like we've had conversations with different people outside of maybe the usual, where investing has come up, interest has come up, conversations around different investment opportunities, and it just feels like this is super timely.
I couldn't agree more, Rach. Like, so timely. And it's like people are more open to chatting about all the things you just said. And it's neat to hear some of the areas where they're struggling and where they're like, I have what the F? Like, I have no idea what to do. And it's awesome because then we can, kind of go back and be like, do we know about this? Or do we need to learn some more here? Yeah, it's been great.
Super great. And a good check too, to when you hear those challenges, to reflect and be like, I have gone through this, or, oh, that's interesting. I haven't come across that yet. Like, tell me more. Like, it's been really insightful and so stimulating. And I'm just feeling energized and like ready to talk more. So it's been really positive.
I'm totally ready too, and I agree. So I'm so pumped to dive into episode 4 today. Welcome back. We are talking about interest, as Rach said, and we have a couple different things to get into here. So Rach, why don't you start us off?
Yeah. So interest. So last episode, we talked about budgeting, figuring out your income versus expense to understand kind of how much money, what your cash flow situation was, to know what you could actually start investing. Now, the key to investing is interest. Like, interest is the secret sauce to building wealth. So you will have a much harder time growing your wealth without the power of interest. Interest is key. And more specifically, it's compound interest. So compound interest accelerates the growth of your savings and your investments over time. Now, the other side of this very beautiful coin of interest is it also expands your debt over time. So it can be both a gift and a curse. So we're going to talk about
as both, most thing in life.
Right. Isn't that the yin to the yang?
Yes.
So we'll be discussing kind of the two sides of interest. We will be diving into how it can be positive, when you should be careful with it, and how it's going to help us get wealthy.
Yeah, exactly. How to use it to your advantage. So Rach, you're going to be yin today and I'm going to be yang?
Sure.
Okay. Sounds good.
I like that, Mrs. Yin. So I think, Steph, most people, when we think interest, they can relate to the debt side of interest. So that might be student loans, mortgages, personal loans, lines of credit, credit cards. They're all of these debt products, so where we're able to borrow money and spend money that we have not earned. The cost of borrowing is this interest. So compound interest works against you when you borrow. So when you borrow money, there's interest accrued. So interest is building on the money that you have yet to pay back. So obviously, if you borrow $10,000 and you pay back five, you're not going to get interest paid on or accrued on the five you haven't paid, but it will just be accrued on the five you have remaining. So if you don't pay the interest charges, then that interest, sorry, let me say that again. If you don't pay off your balance, the interest grows. It's added to me pay, and it just continues to grow and grow. So it's very important when you're using debt, which it's not good or bad, it is what it is. But it's very important that you understand all the specifics of that agreement. So you understand how long the period of the loan is, how much interest they're going to be charging, and any terms and conditions around those numbers. You just want to know what you're getting into.
Yes. You do. And just like, this compound interest is rocket fuel either direction. When you are signing up to borrow for anything, have them lay out that number or find that number where that interest, the total interest over the whole period of time you've borrowed money, is black and white right in front of you. Because usually this will not be something freely given. You'll know the interest rate. You'll know the period of time, let's say on a vehicle or a student loan, but you will not know that total number. And it is shocking because it doesn't sound like much at first, but because it's compounding, that is where it's astronomical.
I remember, Steph, when I bought my first new car, they had 0% interest. And I was so distrusting of the 0%. I really thought, well, this is just too good to be true. So I'm there, I'm ready to sign. We've agreed on the price. And they're like, all right, it's 0%. So your total, right, plus fees, plus whatever else, is X dollars. And I was like, okay, but no, like, what is the interest? He was like, it's 0%.
Yeah.
I was like, no, I know you're like saying 0%, but how much interest? And such an idiot. He's like, no, it's actually 0%. I was like, oh, okay. But I thought it was just too good to be true. I was like, where are the hidden payments? But I'm glad I asked, because suppose it wasn't the case. And then they're like, okay, I actually have to tell her, right? Like you can't lie about stuff like that. But it's just one of those things where don't feel embarrassed by it. Like, I want to hear again 2-3 times exactly how much I'm going to be paying.
Absolutely. And good for you for keeping on asking, even though you heard the answer. You just, but it's good just to double, triple check, because a lot of the times, if it's not 0, it's like, oh yeah, it's blah, blah, blah. And there's like this big fluffy answer. And then it's almost to get you to not want to ask a question again. It's like to deter, right? It's a bit of a tactic. Because they know if you see that it is like 5.99% and you see that total, it's a lot, it's daunting, and it's could back you out of what your deal was going to be with them. So
exactly. So let's use an example. Let's get some numbers. So a very, again, relatable loan, the student loan. We hear about student loans often in the news, especially in the States, where I'd say the cost to go to university or college is quite a bit more than it is here in Canada. So we're often hearing about student loans, people graduating with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and paying that off for the next 20 years. So let's take a probably relatable example here. So and Steph, I'll preface this with, I just got this off the internet. You can Google student loan calculator, cost of student loans, however you want to put it, and there will be a multitude of calculators that you can click into. And there's only a few things that you need to know. You need to know your loan amount, so how much you're borrowing, what the interest rate is. This might also be presented as APR, which is annual percentage rate. It's the same as the interest rate, it's just called something different. You'll want to know the term of the loan. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? And then you'll know if you're going to be putting additional payments on those loans. Maybe it's biweekly, maybe it's monthly. So it's really 4 pieces of information that you need to have ready to put into the calculator. So let's start with a $100,000 loan, which I'd say is probably average for a 4-year degree, about $25,000 a year. The interest rate I'm using is 6%, or the APR I'm using is 6%. And the term of the loan I'm going to say is 10 years. I think this is probably short. When you think about you go to school, you get your job, and then you actually make enough income to start paying off your loans, maybe more aggressively. It might be 15, it might be 20, but we're going to use 10. So when I put this all in the calculator, the monthly payment is $1,110.21. The year targeted for payoff in the month is April 2034. So 10 years from April now. So the total interest that I will have paid at the end of my 10 years is $33,224.60. So a third of my total borrowed amount I'm going to be adding on as interest. So the total I will have paid, total money out of my pocket back to whoever's loaning me this amount, is $133,000 plus some change. So,
Whew.
yes,
I'm sitting over
compound
here kind of
interest.
smirking, Rach, because I feel like you've just dived into. I know I shared last episode around the student loans that I had, and it took me. This is literally my example, and
Mm,
it was $100,000 between 6 and 7% interest. That interest with student loans often changes because there's a
mm,
variable prime plus whatever there's a base amount like 3% plus prime or however that works. And this was it. So 10 years to pay it off, and a third of that amount borrowed paid in interest.
mm-hmm.
Oh, and this is just like, it's part of what has gotten me to my career so I can practice in what I'm doing. And yet I had savings for education, and I didn't have to borrow from the government. I had that savings from investments from my parents or
Mm-hmm.
an education saving plan. That $33,000 could have went into investments of other sorts or meeting
Mm-hmm.
my needs in ways that I need in these first kind of 10 years of my career.
That's great
Yeah.
perspective. And I agree with you. It's an investment in you, right? To get you to your current place in life, career wise. But it's still something that if you can avoid would be nice. I do like to see money invested in this case, if you're putting it towards debt for something that is going to benefit you personally. With anything, right? It's nice to see a student loan. I prefer this example to like, I bought a vehicle for $100,000 at 6%. And at the end of my term, I paid 133 and my vehicle's worth nothing, right? For it. But again, both situations you'd probably want to avoid if you can.
Absolutely. And this is a whole nother conversation I think we could do a deep dive into, honestly. But some people, they have that piece of paper
Mm-hmm.
that's just like above my head, or the 2 pieces of paper, but they're not hanging it up because they're not using it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm.
I mean, this is really good perspective on choosing if you are going to invest that money into education, especially if you're borrowing to fund that education, choosing a career that has a good outlook and,
Mm-hmm.
that you're going to be utilizing that degree. I know, Rach, like in your background, you went to university, you have degrees, and actively, you actually have chosen different career paths, and that does happen.
Yes. Completely different. Not at all in my field, not even close. But that being said, and I'm not saying everyone needs to go to school. This isn't what this conversation is about, but it's more that investment still helped me to get to where I am today. Even though I'm not using it directly with my field, it is
Hmm.
without it, I likely would not have gotten this job for
Yeah, and
sure.
one can argue just the skills that you learn in university in itself, that discipline, all
Yeah.
of those different things. Yeah, it's like I said, whole different conversation.
Yeah.
So we
Cut us off.
digress, but yeah, bring us back to this here. So okay,
Okay.
so we've just wrapped it. So Rach, continue on.
Yeah. So that's student loans. Again, very universal. The other is credit cards. I don't know one person that doesn't have a credit card. So, credit card, a very key difference to other lending or debt products is the interest rate is going to be much higher typically than a student loan, than a mortgage, than a line of credit. So, with the credit card, obviously, likely almost all of our listeners have one. You're using this card as you would your normal debit card, except for the money that goes towards whatever you're purchasing is not yours. So it's the bank's. So each month your credit card will charge interest on the balance of your card. So you have to be careful with any debt product, but credit cards for sure, that whatever you're spending on it, you can pay in full at the end of the month so that you're not going to have 20 to 26% interest charged on the remaining balance. One thing about credit cards that I think people still get caught up with is that dangling carrot of the minimum payment. Steph, has the minimum payment when you first got your credit card that you're like, oh, I just have to pay this $10 this month?
Oh yes, 100%. Especially in the early 20s, and you first get your credit card, and you're like, "Oh yeah, that's so awesome." And then you see the statement after you've made that minimum payment for the next month, and then you see like, I don't know, $80 added, and you're like, "What was that for?" And then there's
Mhm.
this little note, interest charge. Dun dun
Dun, dun,
dun.
dun.
And then you're like, "Oh wow. Okay, like that's a huge cost to borrowing." Yes, and just to bring the Yang, I think, yeah, Miss Yang today
Mhm.
into this, like the credit card side of it. Credit cards are also a fantastic tool for credit building, to make your money work for you in the sense that you're making your purchases with your credit card, and there's so many that have incentives for
Mhm.
travel, cashback. It offers you an extra level of protection on your purchases rather than using your debit card, which I personally don't use for anything. Nothing, unless I need to withdraw cash. I shop exclusively with credit cards because it's safer. If something happens, it's not your own money, and it's easier
Mhm.
to get a reimbursement. And the benefits to it are huge. You can travel, like purchase flights, hotels, rental cars, different passes for different things, gift cards, cash back, like I've already said. There is a lot of perks to it. However, the caveat is, do you have the amount to pay it off every single month?
Mhm.
So this is not above and beyond your budget that, ooh, I have this in my shopping budget. I know I have a credit card, and that's also something I can use as money to spend. No, it's not that. It's just a way you're using to fund the purchases, but you have that money sitting in cash to pay it off.
Absolutely. I do use my credit card almost exclusively. I think there's maybe 2 vendors, like my utilities, that I can't pay with a credit card. But I also have a travel card, and I at least do 2 trips a year off the points that
Mm-hmm.
I get from my credit card. So absolutely, it can be a fantastic tool. One thing I've learned actually about the minimum payment stuff is for the longest time, I was under the impression that the minimum payment was just to cover the interest. So I did a bit of research and found that most credit card companies, the minimum payment is just an arbitrary percentage that they apply to the balance. And you won't, so the how I found out the minimum payment was I had to go back through the service agreement to see what was stated there. But for my credit card, it's 3%. So Visa has picked this 3% and said that's the minimum payment. So they apply it to your principal. So if I spend $1,000 this month on my credit card, 3% is what my minimum payment will end up being. But it doesn't mean it covers my interest. It's nothing. It's just an arbitrary 3%. So even if you think, oh, at least I'm covering the interest, or, if I just do this minimum payment, I'll still slowly chip away. It will take you
Mm.
years. It will take you
Mm.
years to pay off the interest and the principal on that card. So again,
That's a
you
good
can,
point, Rach.
Mhm.
Like that's really powerful, like to just know that that's not even, because I think even on the statements, to speak to what you've just said, you go down and it will show you the number of years to pay off that. And a lot of times it's very depressing because it's like 45 years
Oh my God.
and you've got maybe it's like 15 grand. Like I'm just throwing a number out there, but
Mhm.
and it's what? What do you mean 45 years? Like this is only 15 grand. Yeah. So you had highlighted a really good example. Do you want to just walk the listeners through this one
Yes.
about making the minimum payment?
And it probably makes your 45 years for 15,000 quite accurate. So again, you can Google a tool. You can say credit card principal interest payment plan, something like that. Like there's so many things available on the net. So this one I pulled, and the example was, let's say you owe $5,000 on a credit card and the interest rate is 20%, which I will say this interest rate is low. So
Mm-hmm.
$5,000 you've spent, 20% is your interest rate, and the minimum payment is the 3% overall. So the time to pay this off, if you continue to make minimum payments, is 20 years and 11 months. So almost 21 years to pay off a $5,000 balance on your credit card making minimum payments. The total interest that you will pay is $5,991. It's not that funny. Those should be cries.
Oh,
Those should be
if they
cries.
had a barf sound here, I wanted to. That one, that's the one
It's
I wanted to use.
awful. It's awful. So the total you end up paying, so you went on a trip, you spent $5,000 for your trip to Mexico for 7 days. It'll take you 20, end up having paid is $10,991 for that trip.
Okay, just highlighting it, just in case you didn't catch it, listeners. That means you paid more in interest for this trip than you paid on the actual trip. So you
Mm-hmm.
paid more, like by holy man,
Yeah,
that's double.
it's something else. So credit cards don't have to be scary. I think the takeaway here that Steph highlighted is make sure you have that cash in your account to pay your credit card off in full monthly. Do not get caught by the minimum monthly payment trap. It's how they rope you in and have you for life. So just be
Yes.
careful. And also look for credit cards that have great perks, like Steph said. If you're into travel, find a travel credit cards, make them work for you, and just make sure you can pay off the balance.
Mm-hmm. Great tips, Rach. I feel those are all spot on, and I love the tools you've pulled up here, and they're accessible to all of us with a quick Google search just to do that. We've talked about not burying your head in the sand, our heads in the sand, getting them out of it, getting those numbers right in front of your face, facing the reality. And this is a lot about money mindset as well.
Mhm.
We've all been there to max out, right, Rach? Like to max out a credit card or
Oh, yeah.
to like you've been there, and it's an awful feeling. And if you've done that, it's not to shame you. There's a lot of shame and guilt around it, and I've worked through that on my own as well. I've seen a lot of family members struggle and people close to me, and it's a conscious decision to do it a different way. So
And
yes.
Steph, I just want to say one more thing about not having your head buried in the sand, because the other side of debt is when you know the different interests that you're paying for your different debt products, you can make decisions about where you want to allocate your money so that it more effectively works for you. So, one example that over the last few years has been mortgage rates. So, again, prior to this variable rate, um, that's now a major problem for me. But for a long time, for a few years after we purchased our current house, our interest rate was like 1.1%, 1.2% for our mortgage. So what I did was I had a large mortgage because I thought if I can keep those payments low because the interest rate was so low. So the cost to borrow to buy my house was so low that it made sense for me to put money that I would have otherwise been putting towards my mortgage into investing, because the
Mm,
amount that I was paying for my home interest was far less than what I was making in the markets. So it's not a good idea to kind of dismiss what your interest rates are for your debt products. It's good to know so you can identify, am I paying the right things off first? Does having this debt make sense if I can use my money in another way, if I can make it grow in another way? So,
mm,
and you want to know kind of what those rates are if you are on variable when the market changes, right? So then you can just review and say, okay, does this still make sense? For me, it didn't. Now I had to move money from what I was investing in. I shouldn't say I didn't take it out, but I stopped putting as much towards my investments as I was and started putting more on my mortgage because my rates changed. So I was no longer earning more than I was paying to borrow. So it's just
mhm,
very much be aware of what your interest rates are, both for making money and for borrowing, so that you can make really educated, or you just can make good decisions about where, be aware of that. Thank you.
beautifully said, Rach. Seriously took the words out of my mouth. Our goal is to make our money work for us, not for us to go work to make the money.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's the first step. You got to make money, but then you got to get it working for you. Beautiful said. Beautifully said.
Thanks, Steph.
Okay.
So
Mm, mm.
touched briefly on when it works for you, but can you tell us more about that?
I think you just highlighted a huge point. Like, first of all, we talked about credit cards and how you can make those work for you from a security standpoint of the money you're using, from having different promotions, incentives, different cash back, and those type of things, points coming back to you for spending money. And if you're doing it responsibly, that is a great way to use debt. And then, Rach, you just highlighted an excellent point about using debt to your advantage. So when you have low interest rates for borrowing, and especially when they're like 1 to 3%, and the average return in the market is, 6 to 12, like just depending, like
Mhm.
it makes sense to take that money and put it to use somewhere else to be gaining that money. Yes, you're spending a little bit, but you're actually making money and making your money work for you in that difference. So I think that was just such a great way. So you can do that through your mortgage if that makes sense with the numbers. You could do that through different types of credit lines. Like a lot of the ultra wealthy, they have tons of debt.
Mhm.
Nothing's in their name because they're making that money work for them. And it's such a low cost of borrowing, and the risk is just so much less.
Mhm.
So that's going back to, yeah, not all debt is bad. When we have these mortgage rates that are 2.9%, we have that low cost of borrowing. It frees up our cash flow. For example, too, with buying a motorhome, that's something that we're actually in the process of looking at right now. So very exciting.
Mhm.
So we're looking at different financing rates and seeing if what the rates are. They're not great right now. They're about 7%. But we're trying to get strategic on how can we do we finance it? Do we, pay like upfront and all these different things? It might not be an option for us, but we're seeing, right? And yeah, if it's gonna beat the market, like your investments are gonna beat your interest rate that you have, it could make sense for you.
Steph,
So,
if I could interject for just one moment, what I love about what you've just said, looking at your options, figuring out what might make the most sense, what works best for you and your family's finances, I think that also reflects a lot of one of the key things we're trying to do with this podcast and discuss wealth is comes back to wealth is having options, right? You're not in a time crunch. You're not like, oh shit, I have to sell my house. I'm going to buy this motorhome.
hmm,
I need to sell this car so that I can have cash flow elsewhere. The way that you've situated yourself and your finances to be able to have the time and space to weigh your options, maybe to wait for the rates to come down, right? Maybe to look at what's happening in the market and figure out, okay, I have maybe a 3 to 6 month window to take some action. That is where we want to be. So kudos to you for being in that space where you have these options. And to our listeners, if you're in this space, fantastic. If you're getting to this space, I'll pick what works for you and to be strategic, like Steph said. Super impressive.
thanks, Rach. And it's just, I think that's where that power is. I feel very grateful, like, to have learned about this and just become more aware so that we could be more strategic and have those options. And there was a time where we wouldn't have. So, yeah. And I think, too, just when you have those options, it's just you don't feel desperate.
Mm-hmm.
And you said something there, you can sit back and wait. So your pressure, like it's harder for people to pressure you when you have options.
Mm-hmm.
You go in somewhere and you're grounded and you have that time on your side, like you said, and you can wait for things to change and evolve and kind of monitor away. So there is a lot of power in that. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think there's a lot of great points that we'll come up with like in future episodes to kind of dive into some of these because and I'm still learning too. Like I'm constantly learning about different options that we can use like for funding different things. Like in what you just said about the mortgage, that's something we're looking into too, but it's just such a different time. So I think with all that mumble jumbo I just said, being aware of what's going on with interest rates. I'm not one for the news and watching the news and what's going on in the economy so much or politics, but like the economic side of things is actually pretty key because when you do have that understanding of how the politics are affecting the economy,
Mm-hmm.
that's affecting the interest rates, it's affecting our investment. Having that understanding can help with timing and planning.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's just go back here just to we had a couple of points that I wanted to highlight just on. So, a couple of the key things is giving yourself time. So, the power of time is huge. We've talked about this a lot in all of our episodes, Rach, I think, and we are wanting to drive that home on purpose. Like, there is a reason we wish we knew about this in our early 20s, because that extra 10, 15 years, it does make a really big difference. So the sooner you can start to get your emergency fund in place, and then you have your savings, and then you have your emergency fund, your debt paid off, and then know how much you can invest, the better, right? So that's where all of our retirement funds, the majority, can actually be funded from our investments if we start early enough.
Mm-hmm. Time.
Paying to,
Compound interest doesn't work without time. You need both.
it doesn't.
Yeah.
We do.
So I have no regrets, but I do wish, to your point, and I'm sure our listeners are going to hear us say this for the next 10 years, but had we started earlier, like 15 years could have done wonders. If we took that 5,000 that we talked about on the credit card and just reversed it as
Mm-hmm.
if it weren't for debt, but it was an investment opportunity, then we would have doubled it, right?
Mm.
In 20 years. So we would have almost doubled it. So compound interest is key, but it's nothing if you don't have time.
It's nothing if you don't have time. And that's where, when you have this knowledge earlier on, and when you're acquiring this knowledge through the podcast, and the sooner you can look at things differently, it's just huge. Like, that perspective of delaying that gratification. We live in a society where we want things to be gratified right now. We want to be fulfilled right now. And delaying gratification, learning the skill, it is a skill. To delay that gratification is one of the best things you will be able to do for your life, because you're going to be able to apply that across all areas, and your financial literacy and your long-term quality of life is going to thank you for it. So
Mm-hmm.
not buying that trip right now, buying it in 5 years when you have those other things in check, a wiser decision.
Yeah, when you can go on 2 trips 5 years later, right? Like, it's understanding that maybe the pot's a little sweeter in some time.
Absolutely. And so, just going down to, we've talked about paying down your debt, making sure, in our last episode, we talked about paying yourself first. So, giving yourself that 10% of your pay to go into your savings, paying down the highest interest rate debt first is really key. And then figuring out, what do you have left over, if any, yet to invest. And that's how we can get interest working really on our side, that compound interest. Making sure that you know what your rate is for compound interest, and choosing the product that has the best bang for your buck, so to speak. That's really important. So there's a lot of different products out there. High yield savings accounts. There's TFSAs that can be a great vehicle for wealth building as well, as long as you're actually using them correctly and realize you can invest that. So let's talk about, maybe, Rach, like, I'll end with this quote to go into this next part, but we'll talk about some of the accounts
Mm-hmm.
and just highlight that to start wrapping up. But I loved this quote from Morgan Housel. A lot of financial debates are just people with different time horizons talking over each other. And where that ties in right now is that there's a lot of different options and things that you can be choosing. And like we highlighted earlier in our conversation, it really depends on your unique situation and your time horizon. Compound interest is all about the time horizon. So whether you're 20 and you're 50, you can be having these discussions on what works best to a 20-year-old and a 50-year-old, and you can be disagreeing and arguing. And really, the biggest difference there is, like, they're probably both right. It's just their time horizons are different, so they're not seeing it from each other's perspective.
Steph, 100% agree. And we've been seeing this week. Steph and I had a drink with a girlfriend last night who was talking about her TFSA. And so her tax-free savings account, that she had some money there. And our first question was, when do you need access to it? Right? The first question is always about time. Do you need it right away? Are you wanting not to touch it for 5 years? But that's the beginning of the rest of the decision making. That decision
Mm-hmm.
flow, it starts with, when do I need this? When do I want this? It's
Yes.
definitely the different time horizons.
Yeah, no, beautiful example. And actually, that just brings me to another. There's been a couple things this past couple weeks because you texted me about someone you were speaking
Yes,
with, a younger like woman, and she had some money that she wanted to save. So maybe we'll just like when we're talking about these different products and bank accounts, can we use her as an example?
absolutely. I think she'd
Like
be
that
honored.
situation?
So,
Yeah, like, and we'll keep it obviously, like,
yeah,
we won't say her details or
her
anything, but just
address
that
and phone number is
confidentiality out the window, and then it's like no one's coming to us to do with
no
yeah.
one's safe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's too funny. But just her scenario. Yeah, tell us about
I
it,
was
Rach.
out for dinner on earlier this week, and actually it was her mom. So I know someone, we'll call her Paige. I was out for dinner with Paige's mom. And her mom said that she was so proud of Paige because Paige has been saving so much money from her job, and she's been putting it in the TFSA, that her mom was quite proud, kind of saying, like, we opened it for her, which is fantastic, right? It's just parents wanting to help. Um, so my first question is, when does she need the money? What is she using it for? And not so concerned about the what. Truly, I mean, it can be if she wants to buy a car, if she wants to buy a dog, if she wants to get her nails done for the rest of her life, right? It doesn't matter the what. To me, it shouldn't. It's not my money, but I was curious on the when. So Paige's mom says, well, I think she's wanting to buy her first car. I thought, okay, like when? Oh, 4 or 5 years from now. And so immediately I'm like, 4 or 5 years, the TFSA is not the right account for her. It's not growing. So that's 4 or 5 years. And I'm assuming the amount. She didn't tell me she didn't have to, but let's assume a new car is about 25,000 conservatively with new car prices today. Let's say it's
Yeah.
25,000. Um like, have that money grow for you. If she's at about 15 or the 20,000 marker there, in 5 years at 5%, at least it's doing something. It's gaining interest versus sitting there losing interest with inflation. So immediately I'm texting Paige saying, "Who's your money with? Here are some ideas," right? I don't want to make decisions for her. It's not my money. She needs to be comfortable with what she does. But I'm trying to give her some ideas or some things to research on her own so that she can go to whoever she has this TFSA with and say, these are some of the products I want to be in from this account. This is where I want to invest it, or these are the bonds I want to buy, whatever it might be. But Steph, what I
Mhm.
found really interesting was her first text back to me when I said, you should be investing this money, was a question. She said, "Isn't that risky?"
Right.
And I just thought,
Yes.
sure, but it's no
Mm.
riskier than you leaving your money there and
Oh
gaining
yeah.
nothing, right?
Well,
So,
actually, to be more accurate is just to lose money
right,
because your money is sitting there with inflation
right.
chipping away at it. But to the point, like you offered her tools.
Hmm.
You offered her some tools, and then she just was like, "Oh, that sounds scary." That fear,
Right.
and that's such a good point, though, Rach, because that brings up that fear that we have as humans around taking risks and not fully understanding, and that's why it's so key to fully understand what you're doing. So what that tells me is she needs some more information.
Absolutely. And one thing I wish I had replied with that I'm just thinking about now. There was 100% chance she was going to lose money keeping it in the TFSA when you consider inflation, right? But there, if
Mhm.
you flip it and say, okay, maybe she goes into a low risk investment vehicle, Maybe it's a 5% chance, 7% certainty that your money will not grow in that account. I would play those odds.
Absolutely. And it's just that perspective though, to be like with that question. I mean, hindsight's always 2020, but we'll be asked this question hundreds of more times. But when that person says, isn't that too risky? And then we say, well, is it not a higher risk leaving there and losing money? And then that's going to make them, what do you mean I'm losing money? And just opening up the conversation for that perspective and the reality actually. And I can only speak to that because I've been there.
Right.
So yeah, and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars lost, but it's a new day, we move forward. But Rage, that is so great. So I guess my question to you, let's just pretend you're Paige. What would you do? How would you manage that?
So suppose I want to stay with, let's say it's the bank who I have my TFSA with. I would have Googled, or I would Google low, because I am also assuming I have a low risk appetite, right? If that was my response, isn't this risky? I'm going to assume I really don't, I'm not comfortable with high risk. So then I'm Googling low risk investment. You could do ideas, opportunities, tools, products, low risk investment products. And then I would even put in my timing there. You could put it as part of your search. But as you start to learn about what those products are, then you can start thinking about, well, does this work for my timing? So bonds would be an option. Those are super low risk, and you lock in at an interest rate, but you also lock in for a time. So if I knew I didn't want to touch that money for at least 3 years, then I could buy a 3-year bond. Maybe it yields 4%, but it's still going to be more than it losing money to inflation in my TFSA. I could look at different ETFs, right? There's really so many options there, GICs, but it's just having an idea. Let's say I narrow on 3 products that I'm interested in pursuing. Then I could go to my bank and say, hey, I'm low risk appetite. I want to touch this money in 4 years. I know it's not doing anything for me in this current TFSA. These are 3 products I'm interested in. Tell me which ones are going to cost me the least amount of money to go into.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Steph?
And
What would you do if you were Paige?
well, I just want to say, Rach, I love how you just said before you went in to talk to the bank, you
Mhm.
would go and research your options. You'd get that base research done because then you know what you're interested in and you're not going to be swayed and persuaded and you've got these things. So
Mhm.
kudos for that kind of back work. Nice perspective. In this situation with Paige, and this is actually what I responded to you with, what I would probably be tempted to do is look, she's pretty low risk, low risk tolerance, like you say. And it sounds like it's probably important to her. And I'd ask myself, is it important that I have access to this money in the next few years? Excuse me here. And if so, just with right now where we're at with high yield savings accounts, I think in a lot of times like the bonds, the GICs, they're great because that return when you are locking in is just superior to the high yield savings accounts. However, right now, those high yield savings are pretty decent. You're getting 4 to 5.5% just depending who you're with. So that would be probably something, especially if it's to the next 2 to 3 years that she's looking at, that I'd be more interested in checking out further.
Mhm. That's great. That's a great idea. And again, it's
So there's different options.
suppose she goes in with the 4 options, looks at what those
Mm-hmm.
interest rates look as, and then
Mm-hmm.
identify, you know what, I actually do want to have access to that money. High yield makes sense because if I'm in a pinch, of it liquid. So
Mm-hmm.
for sure, that's an excellent option.
Well, it's better than having it sitting in a TFSA not invested at 0% and losing money to inflation. That
Absolutely.
would be, it's definitely a better option than that. So yeah,
So I think
no,
you've
some
really,
good options there.
and you've highlighted kind of the difference between accounts too, right? So your your saving accounts, like Steph just mentioned, high yield savings, TFSA or tax-free savings. There's your regular savings account. These ones bear interest. The interest could be small, and for a long time they didn't beat inflation, but they will have an interest rate that's applied. Your money will grow slowly. Comparing that to a
Hmm.
checking account where there's no interest at all, you use a checking account to pay your bills, maybe your paycheck comes in there. You are limitless as far as what you can add or withdraw fund wise. So I can put in $1 million, I can take out 500,000, whatever it is. There's no limit there. You might have to pay by transaction, so beware. There are checking accounts with fees. So if you don't maintain, my checking account is like this. If I don't maintain a minimum balance, I pay $10 a month, let's say, for my account. Um, I know growing up, I don't know if they still do this, but it was by transaction. So let's say $1.25 for each transaction in and out of your account. Which, thinking about it now, is completely bonkers because I don't know what. Read the small print if you're looking at checking accounts.
Yeah, good tips there, Rach, because I think most of them now are unlimited transactions in the checking, but there's still a lot of fees for e-transfers,
Mm-hmm.
or there's like overdraft penalties, or if you need a bank draft for some type of purchase. Like, there's a lot of different fees that can be. I just always ask before I do
Mm-hmm.
anything, and then if I get charged something, it's a really easy way to go back to them and be like, hey, look, I asked this question and I was still charged. And then you've got a bit of negotiation room there, right?
I
So
think,
yes, great.
Steph, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a really good point. The bank is nothing special, so to speak. It's a vendor. It's someone who's providing you a service at a cost. You're paying, right, for this service.
Mm-hmm.
That also means that you're a customer. So just like if you were at a restaurant and you paid for a meal that was subpar, you can complain. I mean, try and be constructive, but you can say, I was promised this good that I paid for and it didn't live up to my standard. You can do that with the bank. So don't
Mm-hmm.
put them on a pedestal. You can go and you say, you know what? I need this bank draft. I've been a customer of yours for 15 years. I would like you to cover the cost. See what they say.
Mm-hmm.
The worst thing that they'll say is no. But there's
Mm-hmm.
definitely room for you to protect yourself and make sure that you're not taking the best decisions respectfully with the banks and say, you know what, I don't want to pay this. What are my options? What can you do for me?
Absolutely, because there are options a lot of the time, and this is a whole other episode we can talk about, honestly. And at the same time, there is ways you can do it constructively, respectfully, and also you have lots of other options out there. So
Mm-hmm.
depending on what you're willing to do, you don't want to always use that as a bargaining tool, but like, you're not stuck with them. So if they're not treating you the way you deserve to be treated, move on. Yes, I love this conversation we've had today because we've brought in so many different pieces, Rach, where we're going. We've talked about risk tolerance. We've highlighted some different accounts that we're going to be diving more into, like TFSAs, FHSAs, savings and checking accounts. Like, those will be coming up in the future again. And really, we're heading towards more of that overview investments in the next few episodes here. So I just wanted to say thanks for this great conversation and so many good perspectives, some really good real life examples. And I'm excited to hear what other questions our listeners have after today.
I feel like we really have the building blocks now to explore the investment opportunities, right? Like you said, we know about the accounts, we get interest, which is key, interest and time. I feel like we have that
Mm.
down. And now it's just time to see what the investing world has for us. So I'm really looking forward to our next episode. We're prepared to discuss and just come in educated.
Absolutely. Go ahead, listeners, take a look at these tools that we've dropped in the show notes here and play around with it in all those different. This podcast is designed to provide listeners and viewers with a general overview of how to start investing and growing wealth, provide value to our communities, and live a life of wellness. It is not designed to be a definitive investment guide or life guide to take the place of a qualified financial planner or other professionals. Given the risk involved in investing of almost any kind, there is no guarantee that the investment method suggested in your personal or financial life will be profitable. We do not assume liability of any kind for any losses that may be sustained as a result of applying the methods suggested in this podcast, and any such liability is hereby expressly disclaimed.